Hi, everyone. My name is Travis Rector, and I'm a professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Alaska Anchorage. And I'm also one of the organizers for a group called Astronomers for Planet Earth, which is an organization where astronomers, astronomy educators, and students are working to help address the issue of climate change. And in this session, we're going to be talking with Dr. Noah Planavsky, who is a professor at Yale University, who gave a really interesting talk on the role of weathering, silicate weathering, and the role that it has played in the long-term climate history of the Earth, and also the role it can play in addressing the issue of climate change that we're facing now. If you haven't watched Noah's video, there is a link to it on YouTube, and it'll be in the comment section there. So if you haven't watched it before watching this, I highly recommend that you do so. In this session, we're going to be just doing an informal Q&A. It's an opportunity to ask Noah about his research. And I have lots of questions, and I know that many people here do as well. And so in Noah's talk, he talked basically about two things that I wanted to talk about. The first, of course, is the long-term geologic history and climate stability of the Earth. And the second is carbon sequestration and the role that it can play in helping us to address the current climate crisis. And so I wanted to start with the first one, and then we'll move on to the second. So the question that I wanted to ask Noah after seeing his talk was, it seems like, we've had this this traditional model of the carbon thermostat and how it manages the temperature of the Earth. But it seems like there's these other possible modes as well that may have made the Earth more resilient in its long-term stability. And so my first question is, does this give us any insights into the other terrestrial planets, particularly Mars and Venus, which Mars clearly once had liquid water on the surface. There's also some evidence that Venus might have had so as well. So does this give us any additional insights into what might have happened on those planets?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks everyone for being here, for tuning in later, I guess. Yeah. So I think one of the things that we're particularly interested in is, instead of just having your CO2 levels regulated by weathering in terrestrial environments, figuring out how the oceans can also modulate CO2 levels on. And that basic idea applies to any terrestrial planet with liquid water. So in some cases, if Mars did really have things where it was large, equivalent of oceans or large portions of its surface that were covered, this kind of framework that we've developed for how you can have elevated CO2 levels because of what's happening in the oceans would certainly apply to that. And when you're thinking about Venus, is depending on the history, the same thing. If there was if Venus really had some of the did have liquid water at some point, it would be the same idea, where that could have also played a key role in regulating atmospheric carbon dioxide levels before you had a runaway greenhouse in that planet state. And yeah, when you think about it, what we've mostly thought about it for is thinking about how this would change how we think about terrestrial exoplanets in the kind of broad senses. You can imagine something that Earth-like planets. And I think one of the ones where it's particularly that I'm particularly interested in thinking about is imagining how climate would be regulated in planets that are maybe Earth-like planets, but are a little bit more fluid rich and don't necessarily have exposed continents, which is something in the traditional framework. Those actually have a very poor mode of climate regulation. And I think we're interested in testing that idea and trying to ask if instead those actually might be places that have quite stable mode of climate regulation, and also asking questions of how their carbon cycle in general would work.
So by fluid rich, are you talking about like essentially water worlds, planets that would have very little, if any, dry land exposed?
Yeah, basically. And I think so. Obviously, there's many of the kind of, from a modeling framework, many of the tools that we developed are not going to be directly relevant to places where you develop high pressure ices. But in something, it's actually very easy in portions of Earth's history, actually, you can imagine where we probably had no continents exposed. So thinking about something that is still Earth rich, but or still Earth like, but that's really devoid of a continental landmass, of any continental land masses above the oceans, or being emergent.
And so might this have played a role, excuse me, could this have played a role then in when the Earth was in the stages when it had very little landmass exposed, either like, you know, a water world or a snowball Earth?
Yeah, I think, I mean, this, what our hypothesis is that the carbon cycle in the oceans, the mode of actually forming silicates and weathering silicates in the oceans would, for Earth's early history, be the main mode of climate regulation. Absolutely. That's almost certainly was the case probably for up until around maybe 3 billion, or maybe 2 point, maybe a little bit later than that in Earth's history. So a significant portion of Earth's history likely had was a very different planet in the sense that there wasn't continental processes playing a major role in biogeochemical cycling.
So another thing you mentioned is that this could be especially helpful for planets that are on the further edge of the habitable zone. And I mean, we hear all the time that, you know, about the discoveries of new exoplanets that are, you know, potentially in the habitable zone, which unfortunately, I think a lot of people hear that and they think, oh, that means it's habitable, we can go live there. But it seems like this might actually widen the range of what we consider to be a potentially habitable place.
Yeah, I mean, so the question, you know, one way to think about it from an Earth perspective is that if the carbon cycle and climate regulation operated as it did today, the Earth would have been really icy for most of its history and a pretty unpleasant place. So and the Earth is, you know, pretty, from a traditional habitable zone perspective, obviously is in a pretty good place. So it's I think having a means of increasing your greenhouse capacity and coming closer to the higher levels of greenhouse gases that would allow planets on the more outer edge of the habitable zone is definitely increases the probability that planets are going to be inhabitable, and to be able to be controlled by their biospheres. And importantly as well, there's plenty of modes of climate regulation. What we're talking about, where you have basically a coupled silica carbon cycle in the oceans, is actually totally is independent of having a biologically mediated means of climate regulation as well. So it's not only that you have biology keeping you in a climate situation. This is actually something that's just inorganic carbon and silica cycles.
Interesting. William, you had your hand up, so I wanted to give you a chance to ask your question.
Yeah, you mentioned in your talk, Travis mentioned a short time ago, the snowball Earth. I got the impression from your talk that you don't believe the snowball Earth occurred. Apparently there was evidence that it occurred a few times, like 700 million years ago and longer ago.
Yeah, I think there is very, very compelling, I would say incontrovertible evidence that there was, in times in Earth's history, there was ice in the tropics, which is what the geologic evidence tells us, which is a wild world, right? That is very different place than we imagine today. A lot of the things that are debated, and depends in some ways how you define snowball Earth, whether there was any water open, or the extent of water, are things where you have to tie observations into a model framework. So I think there's the possibility that there was some water open, which some people have referred to as like a slush ball, or a softer Earth, or even potentially beltways of water that were open. And those are in some ways very interesting questions, and they do have implications for how life persisted through this climate extreme. But to me, in some ways, I think are almost more second order than the fact that we had multiple periods in Earth's history where there was ice in the tropics. That to me, I'm comfortable just referring to that as a snowball Earth state, even if some of the exact details of that ice cover are still under debate.
Yeah, if I can ask one more question. Following on what Travis was talking about, these exoplanets, would it mean, I mean, if you look at the exoplanets, you can look for biosignatures in the atmosphere by seeing them against their stars. You can see absorption spectra. But I'm wondering if, I mean, there may be something that can be done that's a little bit simpler. Maybe you can somehow, I mean, if you can detect the exoplanet in a certain way, you may be able to work out its temperature. And if its temperature is anomalously high for its distance from the star, could you say then that itself is a biosignature?
I mean, I would, the short answer for that would be, I would say no. That it's, I think one of the things that is an interesting aspect of modeling, and alluded to before, is that you can have different inorganic carbon cycles, a carbon cycle without life that gives you dramatically different climate systems, different planetary states. So that's something that actually was very interested in exploring this. In one of our simplest exercises, one way to think of it is we tried to ask the question of how far could you push the Earth into different states in its history? How much could you push a Earth-like exoplanet into different climate states? And we were surprised at the scope that we had to change that. As you change some basic aspects of it, like the extent of volcanic activity and imagining different extensive ocean coverage in that state, you can actually come up with things that are very, very different climate states and different planets.
Without necessarily having life.
Without having life. And yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Gregory, you had a question? What would you like to ask?
Can people hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
Okay, cool. So that was a really fun topic on that. Thank you for sharing that. One thing that I don't think I connected in there, and I was wondering if you could maybe explain it a little bit, was it seemed like you mentioned that having free silicon kind of in the ocean is what releases CO2 back into the atmosphere, sort of the reverse weathering effect. And then there was a jump into putting basalt, distributing basalt into the ocean would then sequester carbon. And I don't think I quite understood the connection between those two. I was wondering if you could explain it a little bit.
So I think just one of the points I wanted to make for that was that I got interested in carbon cycle modeling. We think about what's happening with CO2 and carbon cycle modeling in a very localized place within a sediment pile in a soil, with the question of asking what controls planetary habitability, what controls, why were we not in a, what are potential answers to the faint young sun paradox? How do we think about exoplanets? And the actual exact same code we developed and the same kind of geochemical modeling tools we're also using to address the idea of the processes that we could be doing to try to mitigate our current extreme climate. So the connection from those was actually just that the code that we're using is actually exactly the same, and some of the bits of code are directly translatable from those. But in terms of following up on those specific aspects, when you have a formation of silicate minerals in the ocean, and having more dissolved silica favors that produces acidity, or you can think of that as basically releasing CO2. When you're adding fine grained basalt to the system, that sucks up CO2, which makes sense. So in one case, you're breaking down a silicate, and in one case, you're forming a silicate. And that's really just dependent on the thermodynamics of the system. Well, in Earth's surface, it's actually dependent on the kinetics of the system, of course, but kinetics are just dependent on thermodynamics.
Thank you.
Interesting.
If that makes sense. That was a little rambling, sorry. The response there was a little bit rambling, but the basic idea, the code is the same, and then we're just trying to understand the kinetics and thermodynamics of the system.
Interesting. Rachel, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, definitely moving into the carbon sequestration portion, so I hope that's okay.
No, go right ahead.
Right. So Noah, I was an astronomer for a long time, and I've changed fields, and now I'm working on nitrogen biogeochemistry. So I was really curious about your talk, and I loved that deep time perspective that you bring to current problems. I have a number of questions. I'll start with the easiest one and then maybe hand it over to others. So you must have thought about this or been asked this, but what are the emissions associated with mining 10% of the Earth's basalt reserves and grinding it up and transporting it to agricultural fields?
Yeah, well, that would be doing things at that extreme level are obviously is not something we're going to be aiming for. That would that level of kind of implementation would drive us into a snowball Earth state maybe. But in general, as you think about it, kind of for what is the amount of energy you spend, or what is the amount of kind of CO2 you spend relative to what you capture, and it actually ends up being dependent as like a rule of thumb, something in the kind of 10 to 15% range. So you are spending energy in that process, and that cuts from a theoretical maximum efficiency, roughly 10-15% of your total capture from those processes. So the mining is actually, in terms of the carbon cost, not the worst part of it. The worst part from a carbon emissions perspective is actually the transport, which is why one of the big questions is we can understand we can do our best to understand and model what's happening where the reactions are taking place. And that's really an essential part of making sure we can implement this well and this would actually work. But a big part of actually implementing this and seeing if it would be economically feasible and actually something that will take off is coming up with a efficient way to move material between sites of application and do that with lower emissions.
Yeah, that's already remarkably efficient. I was expecting it would be a much bigger hit there, so that's good. Shall I hand over to others?
Yeah, it really depends on, or just as a last thought on that, it depends on, there are pretty big uncertainties in those numbers, and you could, if you wanted to paint a worst case scenario perspective, you could definitely make that higher. And one of the things to keep in mind is that actually where a lot of it falls out is how many, that goes back to your earlier question, is the larger number of quarries that you would have reduces the transport cost and makes that lower. If you are only able to open a few and you are dependent on semi transport, it's going to go up. It's more efficient cost and carbon perspective to move things through marine transport, and which is not feasible for a lot of things, especially when we're talking about agricultural lands. And if you're only able to open mines in a few places, it could come into something that is a much higher perspective than that, much higher estimate than that.
I see. Shall I hand over to other people, Travis?
No, go right ahead.
Okay. One small thing was, you mentioned that basalt additions increase crop yields. Is that a pH effect, or is there something different going on?
Yeah, so it's a number of effects. So part of it, similar to how folks lime fields, which you may have, folks that are hanging around farmers may have heard of. Part of that is actually that you increase nutrient uptake, and plant health can be regular, as plant health is partially dependent on the pH conditions. So you are going to be increasing the pH, which can increase nutrient uptake. But the other aspect is that the basalt is actually providing nutrients into the system as well. So and some of them are micronutrients that can be depleted. So one of the ones, especially for, if you think of things that are grasses, like corn is a grass, that actually can be can get a little bump in growth from having much more silica in the soil. Silica and release in some soils, that can be what's limiting. And there's also some trace metals that in certain soils can be limiting. So it can be that we're actually putting nutrients into the soil, some obvious nutrients like phosphorus, but it can also be that it's just creating, if you're doing it right, creating more ideal growth conditions in terms of the pH for both nutrient uptake and for overall plant health.
Yeah, maybe yeah, so that clears that up. And I'm just thinking out loud here, but at the moment I'm working on nitrogen availability in non-agricultural systems and how rising CO2 levels may be reducing nitrogen availability, both because of physiological changes within plants, reducing foliar nitrogen levels, and also changes within, with microbial activity underground leading to nitrogen being immobilized. That's to do with flows of carbon into the soil. And obviously the mechanisms are very different when you're thinking about CO2 versus other minerals. I'm just wondering if there might be unexpected changes from these additions, particularly if you ever use them in non-agricultural systems, which are much less managed and manipulated, that would need looking into. Like, do you collaborate with soil scientists, for example?
Yeah, one of the things that in non-agricultural, I guess, parts are not how we typically think about agriculture, is very interested in what this could do in, or how this could be implemented in agroforestry and in reforestation, especially in areas that potentially have really depleted soils. And on a nitrogen side, actually, one of the things that I think is the most fascinating angle of this is the other obvious aspect that is dependent in croplands and less so maybe in natural soils, but still is an important issue, is that how quantitative your nitrification is going to be dependent on the pH as well. So if you want to reduce your N2O emissions, having a higher pH in that system is one of the paths to achieving that, which is why, like, for, again, liming consistently reduces N2O emissions just because of a pH effect. So that's one angle that I'm particularly interested in. And in terms of in terms of how it is affecting overall nitrogen uptake, I would guess it is I don't know if anybody's done a great job of quantifying that, or if you're actually changing as you increase silica. I don't know if you're potentially decreasing your C to N ratio. Those are questions that I'm guessing that there's a large number of groups working on that. I'm guessing that some folks are thinking about that and doing a little bit better job of carefully regulating that, or carefully monitoring that aspects in their experimental plots than we are.
All right, thank you.
So I have a kind of a follow-up question for both of you, actually. So Noah, in your presentation, you talked about how adding this basalt could increase potential yield by 15%, and the prices, you quote of $25 to $50 per ton. I mean, I naively think that doesn't sound like a lot. This sounds like something farmers would want to do anyway. So I guess my question is that true? And are there reasons why this isn't being done, or maybe it is already?
Yeah, so in terms of the yields, those are numbers that kind of have that other groups have been able to replicate, and some of it for corn is something in the 15% range. We're looking forward to getting from our first plots what the yield increases are in both corn and soy, and some vegetable ones as well. So I think the yield aspect obviously really helps with that, especially if it can be consistent, to make it profitable for farmers. But it's, in terms of the farmers that we've talked to about implementing this in a broader scale in their fields, I think it's been a bit of a mix. In some ways, one of the things that helps is farmers are very comfortable with lime application. That's in people that are especially heavily fertilizing, and even some people that are not, just because of their soil type. It's very clear that liming is kind of an accepted aspect of agriculture right now. And there are some there are some concerns from farmers that are more interested in regenerative agriculture with potential of trace metals sticking around, which is why using basalt instead of something that has more capture potential like an ultramafic rock or olivine, because I've heard of that mineral. So I think there's some resistance to farmers, as you'd expect, on both people that are more interested in regenerative and some people that are more industrial. But I think there is also a sense that it's hard right now to make a living as a farmer in many places of the world. And I think opening up something that is an additional income stream and kind of making it a little bit less stressful that you live in year to year wondering if you can balance the books on the farm is something that most farmers sadly are really open to. So I think there is part of the push for regenerative agriculture is based on just the need for a little bit more economic stability, especially as weather is a bad year can be really tough on a farmer. So and that actually where that balances out, one of the things that a lot of where the money for regenerative agriculture now is in no-till practices, that a lot of the people that are larger scale farms are not really open to that. So the idea that they could tie into some of the money flowing into agriculture for carbon capture without having to move into a system that to them is a huge change, like a no-till system focused on soil organic carbon storage is something that I think is attractive. But I should say that's not based on really extensive surveys. That's based on kind of my experience talking with farmers and getting a sense of what they want. So not a gigantic sample size in there.
I would just naively think that, I mean, farmers, of course, are very clever, and they've done, just historically have figured out how to increase yields, just, even as simple as, hey, if we spread this out onto the surface, it helps. And I would think that something as common as basalt, it would already be known if, that if you use this.
I should say, actually, this is a very old idea. So especially when clear cutting was really bad, it was actually ground basalt was applied in many places to try to get some reforestation after clear cutting going. So it's actually it's a more than century old idea, and it has actually been implemented in that regard before.
Okay, interesting. Gregory, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So this discussion actually made me think about, I might not have quite really understood what the interplay between basalt and agriculture is. The idea that agriculture, by stimulating plant growth, plants uptake more CO2, and that's kind of where CO2 is removed? Or is it that the plants break down the basalt into finer grain sizes, which when they run off into the oceans, then is able to increase the CO2 sequestration?
So the simplest way to think about it is you have basalt, and when that combines with CO2, the CO2 will be moved into bicarbonate, or the CO2 will be sequestered. Right. So what you want to have is basically a place where you can put tons of this basalt, have lots of surface area for the CO2 to interact with, and you want the CO2 to be high. So doing this in soils instead of just throwing this out in other places is favorable because it's a much higher CO2 environment. Because of degradation of organic matter, respiration in the roots, there's a really high CO2 environment where you put a whole bunch of ground basalt. That CO2 that's in the soil, the elevated CO2 concentration relative to atmosphere, even though it is ultimately atmospheric CO2, interacts with the basalt. You can think of it as CO2 plus a magnesium silicate lead to dissolved silica and bicarbonate.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, so I think the picture I didn't have in my head was this doesn't need to happen in the ocean. it can happen in soils as well.
Yep, it can happen, but you can actually, for some minerals, you can think about the same thing. CO2 in the ocean, CO2 in marine sediments combines with the silicate mineral. The CO2 gets sequestered because of this chemical reaction. There's just a simple chemical reaction that happens, is why the Earth is habitable on long time scales as well, right? In part, as we've alluded to. You're just speeding that. It's the same thing that nature does naturally. You're just speeding it up by creating a abundant substrate for that to proceed, and putting that substrate in places that have high CO2.
Okay.
Interesting. Will, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think you might have partly answered the question already in the discussion, but well, a couple of questions. One is, how do you get, I mean, this sounds like a great idea. You got to have this basalt put into fertilizer, and it has to be, you have to get agribusiness and farmers on board. And it sounds like there's a lot of organization there. So how do you imagine that would happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think one of the first things to think about is we need, there's a large number of groups, there are, you know, quite a few groups working on this, need to have a very sound sense of the geochemistry underlying this, and kind of a life cycle, an assessment of really the carbon released through all of this. And if you're very confident in those, if we as a community are very confident in those, what is going to be needed to really kickstart it, or to make it implementable at a level that is going to affect the global carbon cycle, is to put in economic framework to draw from donors and things, but that's still, in my opinion, going to be very small scale. For agriculture, one of the reasons I'm interested is there's a massive amount of subsidies that support agriculture right now, in the scale of, you know, for China, for instance, there's $200 billion that goes into agricultural subsidies in any year. So it's an idea of taking, and where we are having subsidies for any number of reasons, trying to tie some of those subsidies into things that are also carbon negative emission technologies. And I think if you're, this is something, just to be clear, this is something that costs money. You get some potential increase in yields. Hopefully that is robust, but ultimately money needs to flow into this. So as this is moving now outside of scientific debate or scientific conversation into something that's more politics, or just my opinion, should say. But if you want to implement this and you want these things to take off, you need a price for carbon. And some folks view that as radical. I think that's madness. I think that's sensible. We have you know, the word tax is not necessarily not a bad thing.
Well, you know, advertising and get grassroots support, pun intended. Yeah. One other question is, you mentioned regenerative farming. Could this work with regenerative farming? I mean, even in that case, I think they use like organic fertilizer, and you could put some basalt in there too.
Yeah, so it's an interesting, actually, one to try to ask in some ways. I think if most of the folks that are trying to increase soil organic carbon concentrations, in croplands, the most obvious way to do that is by having no-till agriculture. You're not mixing up the soil.
Sure.
You got to kind of mix up the soil for this to be effective. So it's actually something where the two are not particularly complementary. But I think in many ways, one of the things that we want to do is have a more robust model frame where we can ask where the places where it really makes sense, if anywhere, to do soil organic carbon storage, where are the places where it makes more sense to maybe focus on enhanced weathering or permaculture or something else to sequester the carbon. And having that framework, having a robust framework that kind of has been worked out by multiple people, is hopefully a goal that's not too far in the future.
All right, thanks.
Rachel, you have a question?
Yeah, so I'm at a synthesis center now, and I have totally taken on this idea that natural scientists need to be talking to social scientists and policymakers and this kind of thing to think about the broader impacts of our work. So I'm thinking about questions like, does carbon sequestration is it actually dangerous? Does it just give fossil fuel companies license to continue polluting, for example? Does it let us avoid getting to the real root of what's caused this crisis in the first place? And also, if we start opening basalt mines all over the place, are they going to be located in communities that always get the short end of the stick, that kind of thing? So does that kind of consideration come up in your work? Do you talk to those people too?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, as maybe you know from reputation, one of the positive or negative, depending on the day, I guess you ask me. One of the positive things about Yale is it has a very strong presence in the humanities and social sciences, and the administration really does try to foster interaction between those groups. So yeah, I think those are great questions, and something that everybody doing this needs to be asking themselves for sure, and hopefully not just musing about it and then going back to what they're doing, but trying to engage with people that have a wide range of perspectives on that, and that's going to be essential to make sure we don't make some of the same mistakes we've been making, obviously, but also it's just from a very practical point of view. If you want your negative emission technology to expand, you can't be ignoring that. Those angles. So in terms of the first one, which is maybe the more difficult one, or the simpler one to ask, is that when we're looking at trying to meet 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, the goals set out by the Paris Accord, we are rapidly moving to 0 emissions, and for the next 100 years, we actually have sustained, or for the next 80 years, some number of years, have sustained negative emissions that are way above anything we can accomplish right now. And that's to not surpass kind of a peak temperature threshold of even 2 degrees. So one way to think about it is that we're going to need kind of all approaches to get anywhere close to that. And I think even if we were able to totally cut off and move to 0 emissions, basically where fossil fuels are no longer a major part of the global economy, we still need negative emissions that are way above what we can do to meet those goals. So I don't necessarily think that this is something that is, given how far behind negative emission technologies are relative to where we need to be, I don't think this is something that's going to kind of be is going to just bolster up and allow us to have fossil fuels indefinitely.
Yeah, I believe I'm totally on board with that. I just hope that in a world where we have the climate's not changing, the climate's always changed, it's not our fault, it's too expensive to do anything about it. The next step isn't, we can catch it all anyway, so what's the problem?
Yeah. Well, I think having, one of the things that also will emerge from this, I think, is well, again, this is not my specialty, and in more of the realm of the economics of policy, but in some ways having a carbon pricing that is fair and adjusts some of it, that addresses some of these questions, will help for that. Like, if you have a fair carbon price that will hopefully will run fossil fuels out of it, or will help balance the amount of emissions from fossil fuels, and that in a way that is less destructive than it is right now. So in many cases, you can have solar can outcompete fossil fuels in some areas for an energy source, for an electricity source. And in terms of one way to think about it as well, there are certain industries that are just very difficult to right now do without negative emissions coupled to them. It's very difficult to, for instance, run some industries on solar power. It's very difficult to imagine making cement where you're heating carbonate up to 1,000 degrees with wind power. And that's, it's very difficult to imagine. The agricultural sector and land use change right now are 25% roughly of total greenhouse gas emissions. That's huge. And that is going to be, part of reimagining agricultural systems, and thinking of that as carbon capture is just trying to bring that closer to neutral, which is going to be somewhat independent of how we think about the standard uses of fossil fuels, electricity generation, cars, and other things.
Yeah.
Would you like to go ahead with your question?
Yeah. While I was watching your presentation, I was thinking about tipping points. Like one of them was in the ocean, a carbon tipping point where you have rising acidity and temperatures killing shellfish. And I guess there was some kind of reverse silicon weathering that you're talking about that would end up releasing this carbon dioxide into the air, and then you'd have this runaway. And I suppose that your idea to use basalt on the land and it goes into the oceans, that would help prevent such a runaway.
Yeah, I mean, tipping points are a fascinating topic for sure. I think in terms of, again, thinking about the reverse weathering process, the time scale of which that operates is really quite long. So we can use kind of some of the, and again, the link between that and contemporary climate change mitigation was just, it's a case where the code that we're developing and the general exercise of doing totally blue sky science did kind of directly relate into something that was more practical. So reverse weathering is not going to be a major part of the global carbon cycle over the next 100 years. It's something that ties more into a long-term carbon cycle, but the tools we use to study it are similar in many ways. And yeah, for tipping points, I think one of the things that I worry about most for that is, instead of thinking about it in marine systems, is thinking about what's going to happen in terms of further loss of carbon from the terrestrial biosphere, especially in northern latitudes, as we have significant warming, and how much of a uncertainty in where we're going over the next 100 years that plays into it. At some point, you could imagine, and folks have proposed, although I think it's fair to say there are still significant uncertainties in this, have proposed that you could actually have a really massive amount of carbon release with warming from northern latitudes.
Would your basalt method help with that in any way?
Well, I mean, the main way to think about it is just we're trying to try to think about ways over the next 30 years we can keep below 2 degrees of warming, and in some ways it's helping to, if you're minimizing the peak warming that you have, you're hopefully minimizing the effect of positive feedbacks where it gets warmer, so you have more permafrost thawing, so you release more methane from theirs, and that warms it, and then you have additional permafrost, and then it's warmer, so the soil organic carbon respiration rates increase, and then you release more CO2 from that, and then all of a sudden we're at 3.5 degrees, and ice volume is decreasing, and etc. So you can imagine, although there's difficulties in exactly quantifying how they work, you can imagine something that is, I guess, at least I think of as more as strong positive feedback mechanisms, but you could also, in some cases, and as certainly a fun modeling exercise, you could place those into a case where it is a tipping point. And tipping points are obviously a really easy one to apply to ice volume, because growth and regrowth is not the same as necessarily as sustained presence of an ice sheet, because of albedo effects, among other things.
So I have a bit of a follow-up question on that, and then Gregory, I'll get to you. So up here in Alaska, ocean acidification is a serious concern for a couple of reasons. One is colder water holds more carbon dioxide, and so it seems like we're acidifying faster than the rest of the world, but it's also a major threat to our fisheries. So it seems, if I understand the research, it's really over the next 2 decades that we are at risk of having, sort of a major collapse to our fishing industry as a result of the impacts of ocean acidification on shell life. And I remember in the plots that you had, it seemed like that the solutions here would work less well in the Arctic. Is that correct? Or, I mean, what hope could I give to my fellow Alaskans about this as a potential solution?
Yeah, well, Alaska has a large portion of US's exclusive economic zone, and it makes sense that acidification is going to be a problem in more northern latitudes as before. So I think one of the things you can think about is that, and the best studies on this in terms of how we can modify a local environment, against ocean acidification with something that's carbon negative is in Great Barrier Reef. Maybe not surprising. So for Australia, for instance, right there, losing all of the tourism industry from the Great Barrier Reef would be a massive hit. And you could also think of losing biodiversity in the Great Barrier Reef is something that is very difficult to put a full price on, but is obviously not something we should be super excited about doing. So in that case, what you can think about it in a case of not a global strategy, if there's something like we want to protect the crab fishery in Alaska for any number of reasons, including partially making sure that there's a more stable economy in Alaska, which is something that there would be, there's reasons to think about. You could target basically having alkalinity injections into the ocean in areas that are close to the key crab fisheries. In other words, that was a very roundabout way of saying you don't have to think about this only in terms of a global change in ocean acidification. If you have areas that are particularly susceptible, you can think about actually changing local environments as well. And that appears with some of the work that has been going on, something that is possible given kind of the dynamics of marine systems and what is possible from the ability to change local ocean chemistry.
That's interesting. So have you done any work in that area as far as like, I mean, I'm now very interested in this idea. Like, could I go to, local leadership and say, hey, here's a potential solution that could help protect our fisheries? Have you done work in studying like how that could work on a local level, and, not just from the chemistry, but also, how much basalt would it take? What would the economics of it be, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. So I'm not a physical oceanographer. So in terms of like the actual dynamics is not something in that area that I've thought about. But and one of the things that I'm interested in adding to that is through various mineral feedstocks, how they will be removed from the water column, which is something that is one of the things that we are working on. So I think, yeah, it's something that hopefully people are thinking about this. And obviously there's, the one I could definitely point you to the case study for the Great Barrier Reef, where it was a really impressive effort over a couple of years to provide that scenario. But it's yeah, you could think about it in terms of you could think about it in terms of the economics. You could think about it in terms of just what the actual cost would be. But in terms of the actual cost to, say, like a supplement, because it's in Alaska, which may not be the ideal part, but it would potentially feed into a fishery. It's difficult to define until we have a sense if there will be any sort of economic benefit for carbon capture at all or not. But in general, it's things that with the tools in place, that's a question that it could be answered. And I've heard it's the main one from this is, sorry, not something I'm terribly familiar with, but from what I've heard, it's the one that's a main concern is of total collapse of like the crab fishery. Is that right?
That, as well as the impacts on pteropods, which are a major source of nutrition for salmon.
Okay. Yeah.
So right. Those are, I think, the two most at-risk species. That's not being an oceanographer. That's my understanding. Gregory, you've had your hand up for a while, so please go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the things I was thinking about was, if I sort of taking a look at how this works in terms of a farmer's point of view. So if you introduce basalt to the soil, would someone working in agriculture have to do something to further sequester it so that it doesn't get back into the atmosphere? Or if they don't have to do that, what about this chemistry prevents the reverse process from easily occurring?
Yeah, great question. So as this is going to be applied, just like you would apply lime to a field, the same, when we've done this, we've used the exact same equipment. As the CO2 in the soil interacts with the basalt that you have down, as saying that the waste product of that, or the product of that, is bicarbonate. So that's your CO2. That bicarbonate will eventually make it out into the oceans. So it's going to move through surface waters, or it's going to move into groundwaters. Either way, that is where it's stored. And eventually, that will be stored as calcium carbonate. But
Okay, so
moving from this dissolved phase bicarbonate into calcium carbonate is something that takes quite a few years.
Okay, so thinking about, I'm also sort of thinking about, carbon pricing, and sort of there's big talk about, well, if you sequester it, providing an economic benefit to that would this really count as sequestered if it temporarily stays in the soil and then comes out, or if there's a pathway to be sequestered for long time periods?
Yeah, the great question. I mean, one of the things that's, especially in agricultural systems, attribution is a key question right now. So I glossed over it. One of the things that actually, if you want to get into what's a tricky question with that, is that you remove 2 moles of CO2 when you have the initial reaction with a silicate phase. So you have 2 moles of bicarbonate right now. And as that bicarbonate actually precipitates as a calcium carbonate phase, which happens over a variable length scale, you release 1 mole of that CO2 into the atmosphere. So
okay,
how you actually think about the pricing for that is actually something that is a little bit interesting. But if you design the system correctly, you actually do have most of that alkalinity move out into the ocean, where from a human point of view, a societal point of view, 100-year time scale, a negligible portion is going to be reprecipitated as calcium carbonate. So the simplest way to think about attribution from that, if we have trust in the models, is that you can actually pay based on the amount that's applied, as long as it's following a proved plan.
Okay, but the actual long-term sequestration may not happen until a long.
Now, the initial sequestration is going to occur on the time scale of the reaction of the CO2 with the basalt phase, and then at some point, say 500 years from now, that 1 mole of CO2 is going to pop back up into the atmosphere.
Right. Okay.
So you move 2 initially, 1 gets returned.
Right.
Interesting. Well, we have just a few minutes left, well, before you get to your question, we do have one question from our YouTube channel. This is from Chris McCarthy, and I realize this in this question, this may not be an area that you work in, Noah, so please feel free to say you don't know. But his question is, could you please comment on another ocean-based solution, prompting the growth of sequestering microorganisms by distributing ground iron in key areas? Is that something that you're familiar with?
Yeah, so I mean, as iron fertilization in many ways has received a tremendous amount of press, and was what for many people I think is still what they think of as what they think of in terms of geoengineering. So it was kind of the first geoengineering scenario to become part of popular media and kind of a household conversation almost. So iron fertilization had a couple of very forceful proponents, and there was some very large scale trials in that actually, which had kind of mixed results. There certainly was a little bit of carbon sequestration, but not as much as predicted in some models. And even though there was increased productivity, a lot of it was remineralized. And then there was also a lot of concern about as we're doing this, how much are we also changing ecosystem structure? What are the negative effects of this process? And in the end, I think right now there's, as far as I know of, there's nobody that's actively pursuing this through a kind of commercialization pathway.
Okay.
So yeah, the short of it is iron fertilization was kind of what played a key role in launching geoengineering and starting, I think, some of the most interesting initial conversations about it. but right now it's not one of the main ones that's being pursued in terms of a commercialization.
Interesting. The second part of Chris's question, which we've already touched on a little bit, is the idea of geoengineering and tampering with nature. And so, I mean, obviously, what you're proposing here with basalt could fall into that category. What are some potential downsides that you're aware of? I mean, we've already talked about mining and the carbon footprint of extracting and distributing the basalt, but what are some other potential downsides as far as like messing with like, for example, the chemistry of certain ecosystems or things like that?
Yeah, great question. Obviously something we need to be very, very aware of. So from a natural ecosystem point of view, we are worried about introducing trace metals into the system. Something that is one of the things that really drew me to doing empirical work on this, is monitoring what's happening with potentially harmful trace metals very well. And changing the pH is not going to be ideal for some communities, and you are by design trying to dramatically change the pH of not only soils, which are croplands, which already have a very reduced and managed biota, but also downstream waters. And I think in terms of, the other risks, if you were to have, say, a mineral-based carbon sequestration thing grow to a large level, into a gigaton level, you're going to be moving a lot of material around, and one of the concerns I think will be there's going to be some negative repercussions for that, and making sure that they are not just felt by the people that are the poor, that's not just harming people that are not as economically fortunate right now as other people, I think which Rachel already brought up, is a serious concern. And you can think about that on a regional scale. You can also think about that on an international scale, or you can think about, if we commercialize this as well, if somebody's making money on it, if we tie into an economic framework, are the people that were responsible for the problems going to be the ones that reap all of the money and profits from that again? Is another way you can think about what is the risks with the negative emission technology. But as a broader point, and for, I guess, end on a positive note, I think in terms of, we are already massively changing almost every component of our surface. One of the other things to work on is for natural waters, just studying the chemistry of natural waters. We have altered the chemistry of dramatically altered the chemistry of almost every natural water on our planet right now. There are obviously exceptions. Canada, Alaska are pretty good places, but we've already significantly modified a massive amount of our planet. That is in itself a geoengineering experiment. So what's to say that we can't mess with nature, we can't modify nature, I think is what my response to that always has been. As I live my life, I'm already doing that on a tremendous scale. I would like to try to minimize that, actually, is one way to respond to that, I think. Maybe that's not ending on a positive note. I guess it depends on your point of view.
Well, if you don't mind just waiting a few more minutes, I'd like to give William a chance to ask perhaps the last question.
Yeah. No worries, of course.
Yeah, watching your talk, I was and learning about your research. The results of your research seem to confirm or support, at the very least, the Gaia hypothesis. What's your view on that?
Yeah, an interesting one to think about. But potentially, I think one of the things, it depends what angle of Gaia hypothesis, or how Gaia hypothesis is defined. One way to think about it, actually, is that if you think about from Earth's long-term climate regulation, what we proposed is actually that an increasing biosphere and biotic innovations actually significantly destabilized the climate of the planet. Whereas one of the ways of viewing the Gaia hypothesis, or one of the things that's commonly attributed to the Gaia hypothesis, even though I'm not sure that's how Lovelock really wanted it to be interpreted, is just the daisy world hypothesis, where basically having a biosphere will actually work to provide greater stability in a planet, however you want to imagine that. So we actually were, I guess, proposing the exact opposite in some ways of one aspect that's been attributed to the Gaia hypothesis. That actually, life, and from a long-term carbon cycle perspective, introduces a tremendous amount of chaos and instability to climate and to ecosystems. And from a contemporary point of view, I feel comfortable saying that right now we've introduced and we are perturbing Earth's climate probably in a more dramatic state than it has ever been perturbed. We're probably inducing one of the most rapid climate changes is that we know of that our planet has probably experienced. And obviously where that fits with things like snowball Earth or Permian Triassic mass extinction are interesting questions, but those are things where probably the majority of biodiversity on our planet was wiped out for comparison of the type of chaos that we're introducing in Earth's climate and the impact we're having on life on our planet.
Great.
Which is
Well,
not
thank
to
you
say
so
I'm
much.
anti-Gaia.
Well, thank you so much, Noah. This has been really interesting, and it's exciting to hear about what could be another potential tool in solving the issue of climate change. As I think Jonathan Foley has said, we need all the tools we can get, and so this is exciting to hear that this may also be part of the solution. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a delight to talk with you, and thank you everyone for coming today. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks so much for the invite.
If you're interested in Astronomers for Planet Earth, you can learn more at our website, astronomersforplanet.earth, and on social media as well. If you would like to be notified about future talks and events, please follow and join us.